The House of Dreams by Emeric Hulme-Beaman, published in the English Illustrated Magazine of 1900. Read by Bethina. Trevennan had an uneasy feeling that he had seen the house before. It came upon him quite suddenly as he drove up the long, dark avenue of trees leading to the hall door in the waning light of an October afternoon. The impression was absurd, unreasonable. The Major had only taken the Grange on lease a month ago, and he, Trevennan, himself had never so much as been within 20 miles of Roxton in his life till that moment. Yet the white face of the building, rising up from the gloom of the descending shadows of evening, smote him with a sudden sense of familiarity as his eye first lit on it through the open window of the brougham. A solid, white, square house with windows everywhere and of chaotic architecture, as though it had been pieced together from fragments of many designs, haphazard and without regard to form or beauty. A terrace ran round the front of it, and a wide flight of steps led upwards from the carriage drive to the main entrance. Trevennan's eye sought involuntarily for the shape of a phoenix surmounting the balustrade of the steps, and finding it there, he shuddered. He did not know why. He knew only that the whole impression was a delusion of the senses, that he could never have seen this house before, with its terrace steps and the stone-carved bird on either side. So, to correct the impression, he laughed. A boy in buttons opened the door for him, and the next moment the Major had gripped him by the hand. "My dear Trevennan, my dear fellow, I am glad to see you." "Last time we met was in Belgaum," said Trevennan, returning the Major's grip. "A fine little place this, Douglas. Let me see. I have to congratulate you." Trevennan's calm grey-blue eyes rested on the Major's face with a look of genuine pleasure. Englishmen have a habit of supplying the deficiency of words by looks. Trevennan hated words. "Thanks, Trevennan, thanks. Indeed, she is a charming girl. Belgaum, was it? By Jove, 2 years ago, too." "At the races," put in Trevennan. "So you have retired? Lucky man." "No use stewing in the East with a fortune waiting to be enjoyed at home," laughed Major Douglas, as he led his guest into a large and comfortably furnished smoking room. "Have a peg, then I'll show you your room. I have got some people staying here, Miss Drummond and her mother among 'em. A sort of housewarming, in fact. I hope it will come off soon, next month, if we can arrange it." He fired off his sentences disjointedly as he filled a glass from a siphon and handed it to Trevennan. Trevennan raised it to his lips. "Here's to the bride-elect's health," he said with a smile. Then he paused suddenly. Major Douglas turned round sharply too. Something, with noiseless footsteps, had seemed to move across the room. "What's that? A rustle? Didn't you hear it?" The Major stooped to the floor and picked up a loose sheet of notepaper that had fluttered from a writing table near the wall. "A gust of wind through the window," he laughed. "It's open, I see." And he crossed to the window and shut it with a bang. "Come along, I'll take you to your room. You would like to change after your journey." An hour later the Major's guests were assembled in the drawing-room, waiting for the signal for dinner. Trevennan found himself talking to a tall and stately girl, dressed in white shimmering satin, with a pearl necklace clasping her soft throat. "You are an old friend of Major Douglas, are you not, Mr. Trevennan?" she asked. "Yes," he replied. "We have known each other for many years, in India." "It must be a charming place, India," ruminated the young lady. "It has always had a kind of Arabian Nights fascination for me. It's so full of delightful superstitions and snakes." "Especially snakes," said Trevennan gravely, as he offered her his arm to conduct her to the dining room. "The superstitions died out mainly with the mutiny." "And the snakes?" "Didn't." Trevennan glanced round him as they took their places. There were a dozen people seated at the table, including the host. Among them were a couple of old regimental friends of Major Douglas's, who, like Trevennan himself, chanced to be home on leave. A married sister of the Major's supplied the position of hostess, and the wives of the two military men, together with the Drummonds, completed the number of lady guests. There was music in the drawing-room afterwards, when the gentlemen rose from their wine and had joined the ladies, and the pleasant hum of light conversation, intersprinkled with laughter, was at its height as the silver chiming clock on the mantelpiece struck the hour of 10. Then, without warning, a sudden silence fell upon the party, and, as generally is the case when this happens, each person felt acutely conscious of that feeling of unnatural restraint which such a silence inevitably imposes on an assembly. The Major, in his capacity of host, felt it incumbent upon him to break it. He opened his lips to speak, he knew not, when his eye caught Trevennan's, and his mouth closed with a snap. Mrs. Drummond's black silk dress rustled as she drew out a scented handkerchief. Trevennan laughed. With the laugh the spell was broken. There rose again spontaneously the hum of conversation, and presently the ladies retired for the night. The Major led the way to the smoking-room, and cigars were lit. When they were settled in their chairs, the Major looked round at his guests. "Did you fellows hear anything in the drawing-room?" he asked, with a little laugh, half deprecating, half nervous. "There was a curious sudden pause, you know." "Yes," agreed Trevennan. "And I imagined, of course it must have been mere fancy, he laughed, "that a word was whispered." Trevennan nodded. "I fancied so too," he observed quietly. The rest looked at each other. No one else had remarked the phenomenon. "Marrow," said Trevennan, slipping his whisky. "By gad, yes!" exclaimed the Major. "Marrow?" repeated the others. "A party cry of the sepoys in the mutiny," explained Trevennan. Of course," assented Colonel Graves. "A singular trick of the censors," observed Trevennan. "Pah!" laughed another. "It was the rustle of a silk dress, sir. That was all." "Naturally," said Trevennan. "That was all." The conversation turned to other topics, and at length one of the number yawned, and another flung away the end of his cigar. It was the signal for bed, and 5 minutes later the party broke up. The Major followed Trevennan to his room. "Good night," said he, "and pleasant dreams." "Thanks," said the civilian. "Good night." When Trevennan woke, the sunlight was streaming in upon his bed through the half-closed shutters opposite. "What the devil connection is there," he muttered, brushing his hair, "between this room and Delhi?" On arrival downstairs he found the rest of the party already assembled at breakfast. The faces of nearly all of them wore that expression of lassitude and pallor which is the usual indication of a night ill spent. Conversation flagged. The spirits of the company seemed not yet wrought to the proper level of the day's needs. Trevennan himself, after several futile efforts to engage the interest of Mrs. Graves on the one side and Mrs. Drummond on the other, rose with a sigh of relief from the table and strode onto the lawn to smoke a cigarette. Colonel Graves joined him. "A nice place, this," observed the Colonel, indicating the Grange with a wave of a hand. "Rather curious architecture, though, don't you think?" he added. "Yes, not unlike an Indian bungalow in some points," said Trevennan. "Or the rabbit warren buildings of Delhi in the old days." "Ah." The reference caught up the thread of Trevennan's morning reflections, and he was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, it was to make some remark upon the political situation. The day passed pleasantly enough. The dinner hour came round once more. The guests were a second time assembled after it in the drawing-room. Again the silver-chiming clock struck the hour of 10. Colonel Graves paused in the middle of an anecdote and looked up. Again the sudden unaccountable silence fell upon the room. It lasted for, it may be, 10 seconds. Mrs. Drummond broke it with a weak titter. "How very singular," she observed. "Last night—" Trevennan cleared his throat loudly, not loudly enough to render inaudible the sound of a pattering step. One of the other gentlemen heard it and looked round the room hurriedly. "Why, what on earth—" he began. "Pardon me," said Trevennan coolly, and he reached forward and flicked something from the gentleman's collar. As he did so, he bent to his ear. "Hush, man," he whispered. Then with a smile he turned to Mrs. Drummond. "Yes," he observed, "last night we were talking of this very subject. The Colonel's anecdote is most apropos. Will you not continue it, Colonel Graves?" The Major cast a glance of gratitude towards Trevennan for the adroit diversion. "I certainly seem to hear a footstep," he remarked afterwards in the smoking-room. "And I can swear I did," said the gentleman who had turned in his chair. "A draught from under the door," laughed another. "Exactly," said Colonel Graves. "A draught, footsteps indeed." Yet when the men separated for the night, it was with a distinct though subtle sense of apprehension that they shook hands. No one could have explained the feeling, though each glanced furtively about him while ascending the stairs, as if he were conscious of some unseen presence. Trevennan had already retreated to his bedroom. Before undressing he did what he never remembered to have done since he was a child of 10. He looked under the bed, and as he did so he laughed silently. "The atmosphere palpitates with suspicions," he muttered, throwing open the door of a deep cupboard and gazing into its recesses. "Positively nothing there. I am as curious as a schoolgirl of 15. Let's try the curtains." He threw aside the heavy draperies that fell in folds across an alcove which served as a bathroom. Then he shook his head. "I half expected to find a cobra in the tub," he observed to himself with a curious smile. Then he undressed and got into bed. It was an hour before the dawn, that darkest, chilliest hour of night, that he awoke suddenly and with a start. His nerves tingled. He sat up in bed and peered into the blackness. "Ho!" he cried out angrily. "I understand Hindustani, also Persian." Silence was his only reply. He rubbed his eyes. "Dreaming again," he muttered. "And yet I could have sworn I heard—" And he ended his sentence with a laugh. 3 hours yet," he yawned, striking a match and looking at his watch. "Here's for more dreams." And he sank back on his pillow and closed his eyes. The next morning the Major's guest exhibited one and all a strange nervousness of demeanour, a restless uneasiness, as though labouring under some fanciful dread. Nobody, however, made any comment upon this singular symptom of general depression, and it was not till nearly lunch-time that Major Douglas found an opportunity of speaking to Trevennan alone. The Major was obviously dispirited. "The ladies," he began, "have expressed their intention of leaving us today, Trevennan." "Indeed," said Trevennan. "Why?" "They give no definite reason, but they say they are— well, it sounds positively childish, but it seems they are afraid to stay. They are frightened." "Frightened? What are they frightened of?" asked the civilian, with well-affected surprise. "That's just it," broke in the Major. "Goodness knows what they are frightened of. They don't know themselves. They say there's something in the house. I tried to laugh them out of it. Ellen, Miss Drummond, you know, is quite ill with a nervous headache. Mrs. Graves has got the jumps. Mrs. Drummond woke up last night screaming that she was being murdered. Nightmare, of course. If people will take lobster salad at dinner. My sister, a prosaic enough woman, heaven knows, declares she dreamt horrible things all night long. Graves did too. Mrs. Butler woke her husband up at 2 o'clock to say there was a man walking across the room with bare feet. Such an idea. Butler says he was under the impression when he woke up that he had been fighting his way through the Kashmir Gate. Butler, if you please, who was in pinafores during the mutiny. Anyhow, they insist upon going, all of them." "I'm not surprised," remarked the civilian. "What?" Trevennan fixed his eyes upon the Major's face with calm deliberation. "My dear Douglas," he said, "even my worst enemy can't accuse me of being an impressionable man." "No, I think not." "Well," proceeded Trevennan, "this is a fine house, an excellent house, but—" he shrugged his shoulders. "Ahem, but—" Trevennan flicked the end off his cigarette. "But," he said coolly, "it is full of natives." Major Douglas started. Then he glanced at his companion guiltily. Trevennan smiled. "You have found that out too," he observed. "Oh, that's all nonsense," exclaimed Major Douglas pettishly. "Why, of course it is nonsense," said the other. "Isn't that the lunch bell?" They walked back towards the house for a few moments in silence. Then Major Douglas looked at his friend. "You're not going too?" he asked abruptly. "No," said Trevennan. "I shall stay." Major Douglas gave a sigh of relief. "You see," said Trevennan lightly, "I'm accustomed to natives. The others aren't." That evening Major Douglas and Trevennan found themselves alone in the Grange. They were sitting opposite one another in the smoking room, each mixing his whisky and water. "I have half a mind," said the Major, "to cut my lease and quit." "Yes, it's a nice house," said Trevennan, selecting a cigar. "It should be a nice house," corrected the Major. "If it were not full of natives," smiled his guest. "That's pure nonsense," rejoined the Major irritably. "Natives in the abstract," explained Trevennan. "I don't mean real live ones." "They're ghosts, in fact," laughed his host. "It may be. I offer no opinion." "There's some colour for the suspicion, after all," mused Major Douglas as he sipped his whisky. Trevennan looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" "The man who built this house, the last, in fact, the only previous occupant of it, was General Sinclair. He was, you know, a major in the auxiliary forces that marched to the relief of Delhi." "Delhi? What then?" "There was a good deal of massacring done when the siege was raised. Sinclair, I have been told, was a man of curious character. He became singularly attached to native servants. When he retired 2 years later and came to England, he brought 6 of them with him. Then he built this house and lived here with his wife and 2 children for another 10 years or so." "Yes." "His wife and children died," proceeded Major Douglas. "I gather that the general developed further eccentricities of character. He dismissed all his servants but 2. With these 2, native servants, old sepoys, I imagine, he lived in this house alone. Shortly afterwards, Sinclair and the 2 natives disappeared without word or warning, leaving no sign behind them." "Phew! Go on." "That's all," said Douglas. "The mystery was never cleared up. The house was found one day deserted, and from that moment no trace of General Sinclair has ever been discovered. As the executors possessed no proof of his death, His property was held in trust for the next of kin for 15 years. At the end of that time, the death of the General was regarded as beyond reasonable doubt, and his property, including Roxton Grange, passed to the next of kin. The house was then advertised for sale or to let. I chanced to see the advertisement and took the place on lease, as you are aware. Trevennan was silent. The Major replenished his glass. Presently Trevennan looked up. "Does any theory occur to you?" "I can't say it does. Have you one?" Trevennan gazed deliberately at the glowing end of his cigar before replacing it to his lips. Then he said slowly, "The theory of revenge is possible." "What on earth do you mean?" asked his host. "A mere wild guess. Supposing Sinclair had hanged the father of a Pathan. In those days racial instincts were fiercer than now, remember. The surviving member or members of the family might conceivably await their opportunity for revenge. The native is patient. He will wait years for revenge." "You think the General was murdered, then?" "My dear fellow, I hazard but the faintest conjecture. I think nothing. But there is no doubt there is a strange atmosphere about the place. Last night I heard distinctly a sentence spoken in Hindustani. Of course I may have been dreaming. The house is prolific of dreams. But the sentence was in the nature of a threat." Major Douglas shook his head. "I too have heard mutterings and footsteps," he remarked. "In fact, I haven't had a decent night's rest since I came here. There's something funny about the house. As for your theory, it's all very well, but it strikes me as being a trifle far-fetched." "Possibly," said Trevennan with a shrug. "It is idle, however, to waste time and thought in guesses. I dare say you are right, and the whole story is mere fancy." He yawned and stretched himself. "Fancy, no doubt," said the Major, rising. Something moved rapidly past them in the direction of the door. "The devil!" cried Major Douglas, starting forward. "Unquestionably fancy," murmured Trevennan. "Have you a revolver?" "Yes, a couple. Would you like one?" "Thanks, no. I don't think it's a case for revolver practice. I'm going to bed." They shook hands at the door of Trevennan's bedroom. "The servants sleep in the further wing of the house, don't they?" inquired the civilian carelessly. "Yes. Good night." In less than half an hour Trevennan was asleep, and for 3 hours he slept soundly. Then, suddenly, in his sleep, he became conscious of a cold touch and icy fingers encircling his throat. With a stifled cry he woke. The room was dark, the stillness of it unbroken. Involuntarily he put his hands to his throat. He could yet feel upon it the insidious grip of an invisible adversary. He leapt from the bed and struck a light. The chamber was empty. For the first time, a dread of unseen dangers and a horror of the place smote upon the civilian's heart. He got into his clothes, and then, with the candle still alight, he threw himself, dressed and wide awake, upon the bed to await the morn. It was slow in coming, but Trevennan did not once close his eyes, so that when at length it came, he met it with a pale face and a somewhat haggard look. The cold tub restored him to a measure of his usual tranquillity, and he was glad to find that the night's vigil did not appear to have impaired his appetite for breakfast. "All the same," said he to Major Douglas later on, "I have no mind to be strangled in my bed, so with your leave, Douglas, I think I'll pack my portmanteau." "Look here," said the Major, "I'm not sure that I've not had about enough of this house myself, Trevennan, but I don't altogether like the idea of turning tail, as it were, upon the enemy without a struggle. It's against all traditions. Stay one more night and we'll join forces and see if we can't get to the bottom of the mystery." "By all means," replied Trevennan, "if you wish it." And during the day he instituted a rigorous search all over the house. "I've been over the ground before," said his companion, "but I assure you there's nothing in the shape of a clue to the mystery anywhere." Trevennan stood in the middle of a scantily furnished room, his hands thrust deep in his pockets, his legs wide apart, whistling. The room was at the end of a long passage at an angle of the house, and seemed built into a solid wall of masonry, a species of cul-de-sac. "Wonder who planned this house," murmured Trevennan. "This room wants repapering." He pointed to a portion of the wall where the wallpaper appeared to have fallen away in a slender strip from the ceiling in 2 places. "I haven't had time to attend to it," replied Major Douglas. "Besides, the room is out of the way. I think I shall merely use it as a lumber room." They passed to other chambers, and Trevennan was forced to acknowledge that his host was right. "There's a perfectly shocking absence of any sort of clue," he remarked. "We shall be constrained, my dear Douglas, to act on the defensive." After dinner they lit their cigars and adjourned to the smoking room as usual. "We'll stay here till 12 o'clock, said the Major. Then we had better try my bedroom, suggested Trevennan. "I was much impressed by the idea of an amateur thug lurking about last night." Major Douglas was in the act of lighting his second cigar. The 2 servants who remained at the Grange had retired to bed. The house was very still. The flame of the match in the Major's hand had scarce reached the end of his cheroot when a sudden current of air, such as would be produced by a person passing rapidly, swept by him, putting the match out. The Major started to his feet. "All right," laughed Trevennan. "An advance picket of the enemy, that's all." "Supposing we go upstairs," said Major Douglas. "Not yet. There's plenty of time." They smoked silently for another half-hour, then suddenly both men looked at each other. "Yes," said Trevennan. "I think it's time now." Thrice, in rapid succession from 3 different parts of the room, had the same words been uttered audibly, a Hindustani word signifying kill. Major Douglas walked across to a small drawer and, opening it, drew out a revolver. "Between you and me," said Trevennan, watching him, "I don't think a revolver's much use. All the same, you may as well take it. One never knows." Trevennan followed him from the room as he spoke. In the hall, the civilian paused with a laugh. "When all's said and done, Douglas," he observed, "I am half inclined to the belief that we're a couple of fools for our pains." Hardly had he uttered the words when from behind them came the distinct sound of a footfall. Both heard it and turned round simultaneously. The next instant the Major flattened himself against the wall with a gasp. Instinctively Trevennan edged to his side. The footfall proceeded from the smoking room which they had just left. It was that of a man walking rapidly, almost running. In a moment it had flashed past them, and an icy gust of air swept their faces. The sense of an approaching presence had been so strong that both the civilian and the Major had obeyed that instinct which impels one to avoid an irresistibly advancing obstacle. While still the footfall audibly progressed towards the staircase in rapid pursuit, and with equal distinctness there came behind the sound of a double tread behind it, issuing from the same direction. 2 more waves of air fanned the faces of the watchers. The report of the Major's pistol rang out. The bullet struck the wall opposite and ricocheted back, shivering the glass globe of the lamp to pieces. Trevennan leapt forward. "Come on!" he cried. "3 people passed us," exclaimed the Major, shuddering. "Didn't you hear them?" "Yes, but you needn't have fired. Upstairs, quick!" The civilian was already on the first step of the flight of stairs. The Major came at his heels. An unaccountable nervousness seized him. "I like to see my foes," he muttered, with the perspiration on his forehead. The pattering of footfalls preceded them. Up the wide staircase, across the landing, up a second flight, down a corridor, the sound of hurrying feet went on before them. They had traversed most of the second floor when Trevennan plunged down a long and dimly lighted passage. At the end of it was a door. The door opened into the room in which the civilian and the Major had stood that afternoon, the room with the seams in the wallpaper. Into this room the invisible footsteps vanished. "For God's sake, don't go in there," cried the Major, pausing. "Why not?" asked Trevennan over his shoulder. Major Douglas hesitated. "'Pon my soul, I don't know, but I'm damned unstrung," he ejaculated feebly. "Nonsense," said the civilian, bursting open the door. The room was in absolute darkness. "Damn!" cried Trevennan, halting in the middle of it. "Look sharp, Douglas, and get a candle." The Major turned back towards the passage. "Aren't you coming too?" he asked. "No, I'll stay here." "What? Alone in the dark?" "I'll see it through. Hurry up with a light." Major Douglas hastened away, leaving Trevennan in the darkness. Trevennan shut the door. "No one is going out at any rate," he muttered, "without my knowing it." And he put his back against the door. There was no other outlet to the room. At the same moment a dull thud reached his ears from the opposite side of the chamber. This was followed by another. "What the devil!" he ejaculated. "I wish Douglas would look sharp." He turned to open the door as Major Douglas stumbled in with 2 lighted candles. "Anything here?" asked the Major, peering round. "Listen," said Trevennan. Again there was the sound of a dull and muffled hammering against the further wall, as of blows upon solid masonry. The civilian sprang forward. The sound issued from behind the portion of the wall between the 2 seams on the wallpaper. "Why, this must be hollow!" cried Trevennan. "There's a space on the other side," and he planted his shoulder against the wall. Nothing moved. The hammering ceased. Then suddenly, far off, there came to their ears the sound of a cry. "Oh, hang it all!" exclaimed Trevennan, and he looked at the Major. Major Douglas shuddered. "Let's try again," said the civilian, and both men hurled their weight against the wall. Trevennan lost his balance and clutched at the bare face of the wall instinctively to save himself. As he did so, he felt his fingers sink into something soft and yielding. The next instant, with a grating sound, the wall itself receded slowly inwards, leaving a narrow, black and gaping fissure before them. "A secret spring panel!" cried Trevennan, recovering his balance and staring into the dark chasm with amazement. "By God, yes!" cried the Major, and again the 2 men looked at each other, and Trevennan's face was almost as pale as his companion's in the ghostly candlelight. "Well," he said slowly, "we must go in." "I suppose so," muttered the Major. It requires some nerve to plunge into a black hole leading to heaven knows what hidden dangers beyond. Suddenly the narrow door swung backwards on its hinges. "Quick!" exclaimed Trevennan. "A chair, anything!" He sprang back and caught up an overturned chair, which he thrust into the fast-closing aperture. The door crunched on the wooden frame of the chair, almost crushing it. "My God!" whispered Trevennan. Major Douglas wiped his forehead. "Supposing we'd gone in," he said, "and the spring door had shut." Then the civilian gave a curious laugh. "Bring up that table." They bundled up a heavy table that stood in the corner of the room and wedged it firmly in the black opening. "The damned thing can't shut now," observed Trevennan. "We shan't be buried alive anyhow." "We," repeated the Major. "I begin to see a clue," replied the civilian. "Come, the candle." He seized it from the Major's hand and stepped gingerly into the black, narrow way. The flickering flame threw ghastly shadows on the walls on either side of the passage, and on the uneven strip of the floor beyond. The width of it was scarce 3 feet, and the height barely sufficient to admit a tall man without stooping. Trevennan had not taken 2 steps when he stumbled and uttered an exclamation. Then he bent down quickly. Across the passage at his feet there lay, huddled up, an indistinguishable object. The candlelight flickered upon it. Trevennan rose. "Come," he said to the Major in a hard voice. "I thought we might find a clue." They stepped over the skeleton without a word and groped their way along. "You observe the dress?" said Trevennan presently. "A native." Trevennan nodded. A few paces and they emerged upon the threshold of a small vaulted room. The civilian held the candle high above his head. The eyes of both men were beginning to get accustomed to the semi-darkness. Major Douglas clutched the civilian's arm. "My God, do you see?" he ejaculated. Trevennan made no answer but stepped forward. Crouched up against a corner of the vault, there lay the skeleton of a man in what had once been evening dress. His bony hands were stretched before him in an attitude of appeal, or it may be defence. Between his ribs the handle of a rusty dagger peeped out. In front of him there was a small chest. The lid was open, and the Major and Trevennan perceived that the chest contained jewels and Indian coins of rare variety and value. Lying at full length upon the floor, his right arm thrust forward and clutching the lid of the chest, was extended the skeleton of a native, grimly keeping the master whom he had murdered company in that charnel chamber, shared by death and treasure. With one accord Trevennan and the Major turned. Slowly along the black passage they retraced their steps. Carefully they lifted their feet over the object lying across their path near the entrance. Not till they had once more gained the room did either of them speak. "I think," said Trevennan quietly, "that a brandy and soda—" "So," said the Major in an awed tone, "that's the mystery." "They followed him into the secret chamber," said Trevennan, "murdered him and—" he shrugged his shoulders. "Couldn't find the spring to let themselves out again. Yes, it's plain enough." "But whether for revenge or treasure or both," added Trevennan, "nobody will ever know. But after all, it matters little. Poor devil." "They got their reward," said the Major grimly. As for your lease, Douglas—" "I leave this house tomorrow," said the Major, with decision. That was The House of Dreams by Emeric Hulme-Beaman. This is the 4th in a series of stories I've been reading by Emeric Hulme-Beaman. He was born in 1864 in India. He worked as well as a writer, as a journalist, and as a music critic. He wrote 4 mystery novels, along with William Senior Ellis, under the pseudonym Ben Strong. As far as I know, these are his only ghost stories. I hope you've enjoyed his work. I've enjoyed reading it. If you've missed the other stories by Emeric Hulme-Beaman, you'll find them in the audiobooks playlist in my channel. If you enjoy these spooky stories, please remember to click the like button and to consider subscribing to the channel or joining the channel as a channel member. Both would be very much appreciated. And as always, thank you for listening.